welcome everyone again to part 2 of our seminar. We've got hopefully we've got our audio cooking here and everything else. My name is Scott Burgess with Citywide Title. As I said, we've got 3 distinguished panelists up here. We've got Lynn Madison, who's actually doing the presentation today. She hasn't learned how to sign, so that's why we're doing the actual audio here. Attorney Kathleen Cunningham is with us, handling kind of legal questions we're going to have for this. And of course, we've got Main Street's current president, Tim Ryan. Thank you for being here today. Quick format issue, if everybody could, just hold questions till the end. Lynn usually gets to them within seconds of you asking them anyways, and we will try to address all of those. So with that, we're just trying to bring some awareness to the issue today with the changes coming to the MLS. And Lynn, if you would, walk us through what we're doing.
I will be happy to do that. Now let's get back to making sure this is all working the way it should. There we go. So what we're dealing with right now in the real estate business is what we've been referring to as a paradigm shift. And the definition of paradigm shift is a fundamental change in approach that causes old ways of thinking and doing things to become irrelevant. We've had paradigm shifts in our business before. We went from being sub-agents of the sellers to being buyer brokers. We went from having our MLS books with all of the information in it and us being the keeper of the keys, so to speak, to everything being on the internet. Each time we've lost agents because they didn't make the switch. So what we want to talk about is trying to help all of us who are in the business to make the switch. And the other thing I want to reference is the book Who Moved My Cheese, because it's been out for years, but it's very relevant to what we're talking about today and what we're going through in the real estate business. So let me just jump in here and walk us through the history of how we got here and the lawsuits, so you know what they're all about, and the Department of Justice's problems with us. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we need to do to not fix it, but to deal with it. Well, to find our cheese again. So in 2019, there was a lawsuit filed against NAR and 20 MLSs and 4 of the largest brokerage companies in the country. The allegations in this lawsuit are that home sellers are being forced to pay buyer brokers compensation with no negotiations. It goes on in that lawsuit to say that buyer agents serve no purpose. Now that the buyers can find everything online, they don't need a buyer agent, and the only reason we're forcing the sellers to pay buyer brokerages is to help pad the pockets of our fellow realtors. We all know that's not true. We're pretty sure NAR can take care of that allegation during the hearings. But the other thing that's in there is a big deal, and that's that they are introducing evidence that there are agents who will not show listings if the compensation in the MLS is lower than what the agent wants to work for, causing the sellers then to pay even more. So that's the basis for the lawsuit. You'll hear this lawsuit referred to as the Moehrl case, M-O-E-H-R-L. That's the lead plaintiff in the case. And it's referred to that pretty much every time you read any articles on it. So the, why this is going to do this all day, there we go. Who's involved in this? The 20 MLSs, we don't need to talk about who they are, it doesn't make any difference. MRED was not one of the MLSs that was named because MRED is not a realtor-owned MLS. It's a preferred unit owner owned MLS, a little bit different. There's a half a dozen or so independent MLSs, so we didn't get named in this, MRED didn't, so don't worry about that. However, everybody else is. The 4 brokerage companies are RE/MAX, Keller Williams, Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, and Anywhere. Anywhere at the time of the lawsuit was called Realogy. They are the parent company of C21, Coldwell Banker, Sotheby's, Corcoran, ERA, and I'm missing one and I can't remember what the other one is, but it's a lot. They're huge. So let me give you a little update on where we're at with the 4 of them. On September 5th, in this Moehrl case, and there's another one I'm going to tell you about in a minute, the Sitzer-Burnett case, Anywhere has proposed a settlement so that they do not have to go through these 2 trials. The settlement is $83.5 million. They are going to change, they said, some of their internal policies and training systems, all right? So Anywhere has, and that's C21, Coldwell Banker, et cetera. Okay, they proposed a settlement. So has RE/MAX. RE/MAX has agreed on the 18th of September, $55 million to settle the case. It also has to be approved by the courts. They also have agreed to change their policies. So where we're at right now is the Sitzer-Burnett case, which is the other big one. There are about 8 copycat cases happening across the country, but these are the 2 big ones. We're not getting in the weeds with the others. Sitzer-Burnett is emanating from Missouri. The trial started on Monday. They are now 2 days, so Monday was the jury was chosen, Tuesday, Wednesday, and they just started the trial. There's a lot going on at the trial, and there's a lot of accusations being thrown around. They presume it's going to take about 3 weeks for the trial, so we're not going to hear anything on this probably till sometime in November. But by the end of the year, we should at least know how the court ruled on this case. The Morrill case is not due to be heard until the first part of 24. The problem with this case, there's a lot of problems, but one of the big deals is the judge has already ruled that the mandatory offer of compensation in the MLS is a per se violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. What that means is that we're already guilty. In his opinion, merely having mandatory offer of compensation in the MLS is a violation of the antitrust laws. It means that the defendants cannot bring in any evidence to show that the offer of compensation is good for the consumers. This is not a good thing. So we don't know what's going to happen here. We're going to have to hold our breath, and we're going to have to wait and see what happens. So those are the 2 lawsuits that are going on. So we have already, across the country, many MLSs that are now allowing 0 in the offer of compensation. You may all know that that happened in the private listings in MRED back in June, and as of, Halloween, it will be in all of the listings, can be put in with a 0 offer of compensation. All of the rest of these MLSs have already done it. NAR redefined their offer. It's a requirement that when you put a listing in the MLS, you must offer compensation. Nobody ever said that the compensation had to be X percent. Nobody ever said that. So all of us as realtors who had this crazy idea in our heads that somehow or another there was a rule that said we had to offer at least something. You could have been offering $1 all along, and people weren't doing that. So the fact that you can now offer 0, I'm going to tell you, part of me wants to say, what's the big deal? You weren't doing it before. What makes you think it's going to happen now? But the bottom line is it probably is. So we got to be ready for that. So lots of MLS is doing it. We're not the only ones. It's just something that needs to be done. Okay, so now that's lawsuits. Now we've got the Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice in November of 2020 filed a lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors relative to the disclosure of compensation and cooperation to the buyers. So it was totally separate from the lawsuits. The DOJ has now gotten involved in the lawsuits as a friend of the court, but initially their stuff was coming from a totally different place. There were 4 things in the DOJ settlement that were offered to NAR, and NAR agreed to. Number 1, buyer broker compensation must be made publicly available. Number 2, we must provide consumers all properties regardless of the compensation being offered. Number 3 was buyer agents cannot represent their services are free. And the 4th one is that we can no longer circle the wagons around our MLS and not allow other licensees who might have buyers for our properties we cannot say they can't show our listings. It's kind of like the realtor version of Mean Girls. You can't sit with us. So what the DOJ said is no, if there's a licensee who has a potential buyer, then with the seller's permission, we have to allow them to show the property with the seller's permission. So number 4 is kind of in the hands of the sellers. It's up to us as listing agents to have the conversation with our sellers. I want to go back and do number 2 for a moment, and then we'll cover 1 and 3. Number 2 has not been a problem for us in MRED since almost the beginning of MRED. I was just teaching a couple of weeks ago in Las Vegas, and they were one of the few MLSs that still had the ability to search by commission. So if I was going to set my buyer up to an automatic emailing program, prospecting program, whatever you want to call it, I could put it in there and say I want 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath, split levels between $350,000 and $400,000 with compensation no less than 2.5. So the only thing my buyer would get then were listings that had at least 2.5% commission in them. They wouldn't even know about the ones that were less than that. Now they can find them in other places, but they were coming from my MLS. So MRED never allowed us to do that. So I'm not worried about that one because it's not something we were ever doing. We need to talk about the other 2. We will talk about the other 2, but I want to mention to you before we get there that the DOJ, after they gave us that settlement, wanted to add more issues. And NAR said to them, well, wait a minute, that's not how the DOJ has historically ever worked. You give us a settlement, we agree, and then you go away and leave us alone for 10 years, which is what they've done in the past. NAR sued the DOJ, which may have not been the brightest idea we ever had, but they were trying to get them to not come back and add more things to their lawsuit. So the court ruled that the DOJ had to stick with the original 4. So we won the battle, but not the war, because the DOJ appealed. And the appeal is still pending because they want to add things to that settlement. And these are the 2 things they now want to add. They don't like our participation rule, and they don't like our clear cooperation policy. So let me explain what both of those are. The participation rule is also what the Sitzer-Burnett and Morrill case, the 2 cases I told you about, are all about. That rule requires listing brokerages to offer blanket unilateral offer of compensation to buyer brokerages when you put a listing in the MLS. And the DOJ says that that's an antitrust problem, and they don't like it. They also don't like the clear cooperation policy, and that's the policy that requires our listings to be put into the MLS within 24 hours once the listing goes public. And there are a couple of brokerage companies who have taken great umbrage at that because they want to be able to have, and I'm just going to say it like it is, pocket listings. They want to be able to have the listings in their office and not share them with anybody else. So when I was at an NAR meeting a few months ago, I said to somebody from this company, who shall go nameless, but their abbreviations may stand for pocket listing services. They're suing us, I can tell you who it is, PLS. And I said to the PLS gentleman, well then don't join our MLS. If you don't like the rules, then don't what? Don't join the MLS. And you can keep all your listings in your pocket. And he said in front of a couple of 100 people, yeah, but then we wouldn't have access to all of your listings. Thank you very much for the little bit of humor I just threw in there. Well, he was trying, and everybody in the room just went, dude, did you hear yourself? So in other words, they don't want to be forced to put the listings in the MLS, but they want to join the MLS to have access to the listings. So that's still working its way through the DOJ. So we're in a holding pattern on this one. We're in a holding pattern because nothing's happened with it yet. So right now, the only thing that's in the court system is the one in Missouri that is going on even as we speak. Who even knows what they're talking about at the moment? We can check that out when we're done here. So NAR made some changes to the Code of Ethics in the MLS rules based on what the DOJ originally wanted. These rule changes were made in '22. The first thing is a change to the Code of Ethics that now says realtors must not represent that their brokerage services are free unless they are receiving no compensation from anybody, any party, any place for their work they're doing. So all of you, if there are any of you who are still, and there are, because I've seen it on TikTok, I've seen it on Facebook, I've seen it on websites. You go on there and the first thing it says is, use a buyer agent, it doesn't cost you anything. It's free. It's not free. I've been saying lying liars who lie for years because the buyers have always been paying the commission, and the amount of money they paid the what? Paid the seller. Arguably, the seller didn't have any money until the buyer showed up with buckets full of cash or a 30-year mortgage. And yet we've been saying to the buyers it's free. So you can't do that anymore. No more saying that the compensation is free. The other thing that changed, because the DOJ said we have to make the buyer brokerage compensation publicly available. So the MLSs now include the offer of compensation in the IDX feed that goes from the MLS to your websites. Whether or not your brokerage company is publishing the buyer brokerage compensation on your website, on all of your listings, that's up to your brokerage company, but it is in the IDX feed. There are brokerage companies that are publishing it. Zillow is, Redfin is, and there's others, but those are probably the two, you think, the two biggest
you'll see
ones?
it in public. Yep.
Yeah, you're gonna see it. And your buyers, whether we like it or not, the buyers are going on the internet, looking around, and they're finding it. So it wouldn't surprise me that your buyers are asking you about the offer of compensation. So it is
Some
being
buyers
made.
are.
Well, and a lot of sellers are too.
Yeah.
So it's not always a bad thing, because it's opening up the conversation. So be ready for that, because it is being published. Now, this is a mock-up, if you will, of a listing in MRED. The buyer brokerage compensation is now on the client copy of the MLS sheet. If we're going to make it publicly available, then your buyer needs to know what it is. So it's on there. So when you pull up the client copy, you're going to give it to your buyer and the compensation is there. I don't know how we can, I don't even know how to say it. I don't know how we can get away with not having the conversation about compensation anymore. And that's what the DOJ wanted. The DOJ said this has got to be what? It's got to be transparent. We got to stop making it look like or sound like there's no, that the buyer's not paying it. So what could happen from all of these lawsuits? These are what smarter people than me have said could happen. The courts could end up blaming the MLS and NAR for this whole mess and make them separate.
Which they kind of are already.
They're heading in that direction.
Yeah.
And CMLS, which is the Council of Multiple Listing Services, just got done with their annual meetings, last week. And this was a large part of the conversation that they were having there, is that they're concerned about this, because if they separated, it would change everything that we do. So they could forbid any offer of compensation in the MLS at all. In other words, you can't even offer. I will tell you, and we decided for this, just some things I don't have time, we don't have time to go into, but there are many groups that are of the opinion, many groups that have some power and some clout, that the listing brokerages should be paid by the sellers, and the buyer brokerages should be paid by the buyers, and never the twain shall meet. There should be no commingling, their words, not mine, commingling of those compensations. So they could say no offer of compensation, because then there's no price fixing. They could forbid mandatory offer in the MLS, which is what the best of this would be that. Well, the best of this is we would win. But we still need to change the way we do things.
Yes.
The bottom line is, we've been doing it wrong all these years, so it just doesn't even make any sense to continue to make it sound like the buyer's not having any responsibility in paying all of this. So I wanted to share with you, because this was a relatively recent article. It was in Real Trends. And as many of you know, there's a half a dozen different news reporting services within the real estate space, and Real Trends is one of them. But I thought what they wrote was very interesting. It started out with brokers and agents who don't prepare for compensation changes will lose market share and opportunities. Inside of the rest of that, what you see there, it says, in the absence of the NAR membership requirement and the NAR rule of guaranteed compensation, if that all happens, this means that the lazy real estate agents who provide very little value to their client can no longer just show up and know they will automatically get paid a percentage of the sales price just for writing a contract. And then it says, imagine that. Because you know what? That is what's happening. And you guys have all been on the other end of those transactions. Because you make the same amount of money when you accept what the listing office is paying, when you just fell out of pre-licensing class, as the agent does, who's been in the business for 25 years and has $50 million worth of production under their belt. So it is the only profession I can think of that is where it happens. It doesn't happen with doctors, it doesn't happen with lawyers, it doesn't happen with hairdressers, for goodness. It doesn't happen with plumbers. It doesn't happen with anybody other than what? You find another one for me, because I don't think we've got anybody else.
Well, with the exception of doctors, you never know what you're going to pay.
Well, that's true, because they never tell you ahead of time, do
No.
they? By the way, yeah, no, come to think of it. Yeah, but the bottom line is, maybe they should. Well, we'll stick the DOJ on them
I was
next.
gonna say, I hear a
Yeah.
lawsuit.
Forget
There's
that
a
bypass.
lawsuit, yeah.
Can't afford it.
So this goes on to say, the need to evidence value suddenly becomes the only pathway to earning a commission. Clearly, this will weed out those who fail to articulate their value proposition. So our compensation conversation with the clients has to change. What you say to the sellers, what you say to the buyers is going to have to be different than what we've been saying. So there's a high probability that you're going to need a buyer representation agreement to get paid. Let's be real. On November 1st, when you wake up and when you go on to the MLS, if you see a bunch of zeros in there, and those are houses your buyers want to see, how are you going to get paid if the offer of compensation in the MLS is zero? You better have a what? You better have a buyer rep agreement. Because otherwise you're working for, I think the word I'm looking for is zero. Yeah, I think that's the word we're looking for. And the only way you're going to get a buyer to sign your buyer rep agreements is if you can articulate your value proposition. We've all been doing a fabulous job all the time of articulating our value proposition to the sellers. Because they won't list with you if you don't show them what you're going to do to help them get the most money, the quickest sale, least amount of inconvenience, and get them to the closing table. They won't list with you. So you've learned how to do that. My point is, we can all learn how to do our value proposition with our buyers. Some of you already are, but a lot of us are not. A lot of us are acting like Jack-in-the-Box real estate, and the buyer calls and says, I want to see 412 Elm Street, and we jump up from our desk, and we just what? Meet them at 412 Elm Street, like it's what? Like you're an Uber driver. So it's something that we're going to have to look at. So we are where we are. However we got here, what matters is what we do next. And I just kind of want you to hang on to that thought as we're going through this. So for our realtors, how will you explain compensation to the sellers? It is still going to be in their best interest to offer compensation to the buyer brokerage, because most of our buyers do not have extra cash to pay their brokerage companies. I think we all know that. This could be a huge problem for first-time home buyers and for anybody who doesn't have a ton of cash. And we don't want that to happen. So we need to, that's part of our conversation with the sellers. How will you get paid as a buyer brokerage? You're going to need a buyer rep agreement, because you know, and just as sure as we're all listening to this, there are going to be brokerages out there that are going to offer zero. what you know it's going to happen. And how will you change what you say and do with your buyer clients as well? Our dialogue has to change, and we have to be more transparent about compensation. Now, there are unintended consequences of all of this. And we don't have all the answers yet. So I just thought I'd throw some of those unintended consequences out here. If your buyer wants to ask the seller to pay the compensation, and that is one of your buyer's options, what will the lenders need to see? And will you need to clear this with the lender before you start adding compensation in there? Will they allow it to be a closing cost, or will it have to be a separate entity? We don't have all the answers. Tim's going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, okay? As I said, can it be a closing cost? The attorneys. What are the attorneys going to want to see? Is this going to change anything that the attorneys do? We've already had a couple of problems with buyers who have written into the contract that they wanted the seller to pay an additional 1%, 2% commission or whatever. And we've had a couple of attorneys who have said the seller doesn't have to do that, it's illegal, the buyer had no right to ask. We need to make sure that the attorneys are all on, up to speed on what this is happening. What will the title companies need from us? I've talked a little bit with Scott about this. If the compensation is coming partially from the listing side of the closing statement, and the buyers also paying their brokerage, you're going to need 2 closing statements from the brokerage companies. So it's going to change what we do. So a compensation statement from both sides, which now comes back to your offices, which means you're going to have to change your internal office policies on what we do. So you're going to have to stay tuned to all of this, and we'll talk more about this stuff after I dump all the rest of this on you. Because we've got a whole lot of unintended consequences that come from this. So, as I said before, most brokerages do a credible job in articulating their value to the sellers. We need to fine-tune what we're saying on the buy side. But with the sellers, we've got to stop saying the commission we charge is X and we pay out Y to the co-op brokers. And then we go further than that in some cases and say, if we don't pay out at least Y, nobody will show your listing. And then we wonder where this lawsuit came from. The lawsuit came from some of us saying things that we shouldn't have been saying. So we need to talk about the listing compensation is this. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, this is the compensation that our brokerage company charges to put everything in place to get you the most money, quickest sale, least amount of inconvenience, and get to the closing. Now let's talk about what we're going to pay out to the co-op broker. The brokerage company that brings in the buyer. That's a separate piece of money. When you add those 2 pieces together, you come up with the total compensation. And for those of you who are Main Street members, and for those of you who and I don't know the other associations' paperwork as well as I know Main Street's, but a lot of the associations were changing our listing agreements. So instead of starting with the big number and then just talking about what we're paying to the co-op broker, we're starting with, it looks more like what you see here. Listing compensation plus buyer brokerage compensation equals the total. It really is just a different way to have the conversation. So, the sellers. You're going to need to make sure they understand that most of the buyers in our marketplace do not have that additional 2, 2.5, or 3% to pay their brokerages themselves. The buyers will probably want to include it in their offer to the seller. The way they've been doing it for years. That's the way it's been handled for as long as any of us can remember. They cannot add it to the mortgage right now. So right now my buyer can't buy the house for $100,000, put down $10,000. So the contract reads he's going for a $90,000 mortgage, okay? But he goes to the lender and says, I want to mortgage $93,000 because I need $3,000 to pay my brokerage. It won't happen. It's just, now that doesn't mean that there aren't people at a pay grade higher than ours talking with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA about, you'll notice I left VA out of that conversation, talking to them about what difference does it make how we got to 103? Does that make sense whether it came from the seller or it came from the buyer as long as it still appraises? So there's a lot, again, That's all gotta be worked out. And the buyer representation agreements are always going to be different. So I wanna make sure that everybody knows, before we go into another antitrust problem, what you choose to put in your buyer rep agreement has nothing to do with the listing side anymore. Does that make sense? So for you to say, we're gonna charge X, because that's what's normally charged in our marketplace, now you're in just as much trouble as you were when you were doing it on the what? On the listing side. So this is a decision that your company's gonna have to make, or you guys are gonna have to make. Because you can't say that's because that's what everybody else charges, okay? And I already started in on this. The difference between adding it and including it, the lender won't allow them to do the 10,000 down on 100,000 and then mortgage 93. But they will allow this, pay the seller $103,000 for the house, put down 10,000 and mortgage 93. I'm sorry, this is a pretty good example of tomato. What difference does it make how we got to that 103? But this has to come from what? From Fannie and Freddie are gonna have to make some changes.
Well, I think it's interesting that we know that they'll accept it this way because as realtors, we've been negotiating concessions for,
Yeah.
I don't know, years.
For years.
Mm-hmm. So this isn't gonna be difficult to do.
No.
But the question is, we have to play the tomato.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's unfortunately what's happening now is that, and you're gonna see a slide in here someplace where I talk about the bottom line. And the bottom line is, it's gonna end up being the same as what we do now, but with a whole lot of extra steps involved.
So, sorry to interrupt you, but this
Go.
reminds me of a quote I heard on the radio the other day. It turns out that the owners of Birkenstocks, they've been family owned for over 200 years, and they're going public. But what the owner said, because they asked the owner, why are you going public today? And he said, because in order for, he says, everything has to change so everything can remain the same.
Whoa. Wow, interesting.
And I thought,
That was
this
pretty
is-
deep, by the way,
this
that
is
was pretty deep.
Absolutely what we're going through.
Yeah.
Like, everything's got to change so everything can remain the same.
Yeah.
And the difference here is, we're a lot more transparent, the buyer knows that the commissions are negotiable,
Yeah.
and there's none of this, at the closing table, they suddenly realized that, you know, a chunk of money from the proceeds got paid to their agent. And their agent's not taking the check, sliding across the table, putting it in their binder and rustling out the door. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, right?
You're right. It is, and there's another piece of this that I wanted to talk about. Yeah, it still needs to appraise. So if we start, and it should still appraise. Doesn't make any difference how we got to the 103, because the 103 would have been what it would have sold for if the seller was offering compensation. But I wanted to share with you another thought. Let me go back to, why is it not? Let's hope it's going to do that. There we go. So, if you have, I don't have it in here, so let me just kind of wing it for a minute. If all of these lawsuits, if they are believing that the sellers did not pay buyer brokerage compensation, that the sellers were going to net more money on their house, they're crazy. Because that was never the seller's money to start with. That was always earmarked as money for the what? For the buyer brokerage. Because the seller signed a listing agreement, and in the listing agreement it said that's where that money is going. So here's the other thing that's going to happen. If I'm doing comps for my buyer, and there were 8 houses that sold in the area. They all sold for $100,000, or very close to $100,000. They all paid a 2.5% or 3% commission. All right, so let's use 100,000 and 3% commission, just for an example, because I'm mathematically challenged, so that works. So this listing is offering 0, but they're still asking $100,000. My buyer's going to pay me directly. He is not going to pay that seller $100,000. He's going to pay that seller what? $97,000, because every other one of those sellers paid the buyer brokerage compensation. Why is my buyer going to give that seller $100,000 and give me the $3,000 compensation? I'll show them that buyer agents don't have any purpose. I mean, really, there's no way that the buyers, I mean, that's our job, is to say, this is going to happen. Now, I will tell you, and you already know this, if you've read what, all right, full disclosure, I'm on MRED's board. I just came from my board meeting. I'm vice chair of MRED. All right, we got that out on the table. Most of you knew that already. Okay. As of November 1st, when you report a listing as sold in the MLS, you will be reporting what the buyer brokerage compensation was at the closing, because it's going to affect your comps. So that change, you've already been notified of that. It's been on the MLS. When you log on to Connect, it popped up and said, you need to read this. And you all hit the button that says, ain't nobody got no time for this. and I know, because I've done it too. And I even know it's coming. And
You gotta make that button float around.
yeah,
so
the
it
button's
moves
gotta,
around.
yeah, so you gotta find, it'd be faster to read it than to catch the moving button. What's a good idea? I'll suggest that, a moving button. But it has been on there, so you might wanna go take a look at it, because it's talking about what you're gonna have to report. And it does make sense that way. The appraisers talked about that too.
I was gonna ask if
Yeah.
this is gonna affect appraisals and
Yes,
appraise, where
it
they
will.
can appraise it for less because of the fact that there's no compensation to the buyer's
Yeah.
broker.
Yeah, it's going to become a factor in our what? In our CMAs. So, yeah, and the appraisers asked for it as well, so.
More
it's gonna
math.
change. More math.
Well,
I
It's
know.
interesting that the statistic has always been realtors netted sellers more money for their homes.
Yeah. It's there. All right, if you do not have a written buyer agreement, you're gonna disclose the range of compensation to the buyers, you're gonna show them where it shows up on the client copy, and then just make sure they understand when they buy 412 Elm Street, it's gonna cost them X, whatever, I mean, it's on there. Now, they have options, if you have a buyer rep agreement. There are no options for the buyer, it's not gonna cost them anything, well, it is in how much they pay the sellers, but they're not writing a check to you, they're not doing anything. And by the way, you're working for whatever is in the MLS. I don't care if 4 cents in a chicken is in the MLS, that's all you're getting, if you don't have a buyer rep agreement. So we're gonna need to look at what you need to do with that. So with a buyer rep agreement, you and your buyer establish your value between the two of you. And by the way, I've used buyer representation agreements since the 80s. Honestly, it was probably illegal back, it was illegal back then. We weren't even supposed to be agents of the buyers back in the 80s. We didn't become buyer agents until 1995. So for 15 years or so, I was using buyer rep agreements, and I probably shouldn't have been. I don't know what my managing broker was doing. What, putting blinders on, letting his top producing agent do whatever she wanted? That's exactly what he was doing. And the reason I did it, 2 reasons, the only one I'm going to talk about here, one of them was controlling my time. But the big reason was, I was salesman of the year for the company that I worked for in the 3rd full year I was in the real estate business with over 100 transactions. And I didn't understand, and I said this to you guys before, I'm worth more than you think I am. You're the listing office and you're telling me I'm worth whatever you're putting in the MLS. I think I should be negotiating my compensation with the person that I'm working for. They're the ones who should say, and I should be able to sell my value proposition to my buyer, and my buyer should say, yeah, I see it. And why am I getting the same amount of money as somebody who's been and got out of pre-licensing class 12 minutes ago? And so you and the buyer decide, not the seller and the listing agent, what your value is. If for no other reason you ought to want to do this. Does that make sense? So you can, although I will say, sometimes when I say this, I have people come up to me afterwards and they go, but I don't know how to explain to them what I do for that money. And I go, I know that's the problem.
Yeah.
We have a problem with the what? With the value proposition and being able to explain what we do. So compensation is negotiable. You can ask for more before you show the property. If I have a buyer rep agreement with my buyer, you're offering X, my buyer rep agreement is for Y, 2% difference between your X and my Y. I absolutely can call you before I show the property. I can ask you if your seller will pay more. And when you call me back, and you do have to call your seller, by the way. This is not your decision. I'm not asking you for more of your money. I'm asking if your seller will pay it. And when you call me back and tell me something about sunshine, sand, and the horse that I rode in on, and you're not going to give me any more, then my buyer has choices. My buyer can choose to not look at the property. My buyer can choose to pay my brokerage at the closing, or my buyer can ask your seller to pay it as a part of the contract. And I'm going to get into how you do that in just a second, okay? So, but the buyer does have choices. And my buyer will know what his choices are. And I know some of you are thinking, all right, let me back up for a minute. Some of you have never sold houses in anything besides the seller's market that we've been in since COVID. My sweet summer child. You have no idea. And I've got people in this room going, yeah, they have no idea, do they? Some of us sitting here, we sold during a recession. We sold between 2008 and 2012 when we had, right now we have 1.3 months worth of inventory in the whole entire Chicagoland area. So if no new listings came on, we would have no inventory a month and a half from now. We'd have nothing. We had, in some marketplaces, 40 months of inventory. Our job back then was trying to have something to say to our sellers every week when we had nothing to say to our sellers because nothing was selling.
It was, oh geez, another listing.
Great. Yeah, I know. Oh God, I don't need another listing. I don't have time for another listing. I don't want to do this. I need buyers. But believe me, when there are 10 houses for sale in a subdivision or 10 units for sale in a condo building, the buyer will say, show me the other 9, where my compensation is what? Is covered. So I don't have to negotiate the compensation at the same time I negotiate the contract. So depending on the market, any one of those 3 things can happen. So we talked about this already. They will become a factor in when we're doing CMAs and all that kind of stuff. And there's the example I was looking for. I thought I had it earlier. About the comps show the houses all sold for $100,000. It's not going to happen. Okay, I got to say something else to you right now because this has bugged me for years. When I managed, and I managed for big company, my agents were not allowed to offer buyer brokerage bonuses. They were not allowed to, because in my opinion, my offering you a bonus, if you sell my listing, is violating Illinois law. Illinois law says that we're supposed to put our client's interest ahead of everyone else's instead of including our own. Are you saying that when your listing's not selling, that when you offer a $5,000 bonus, that now I'm going to what? Unleash the hounds? I'm going to let the buyers that I've corralled up someplace out to show your listing because you're going to pay me $5,000 more? There's no way I should be taking any kind of a bonus. As a matter of fact, I can't take a bonus unless I what? Disclose it to the buyer. Why are you offering bonuses? Let's not add to the problem here because that is totally what the DOJ and the class action lawsuits are talking about. Offer a bonus and now all of a sudden we'll what? We'll sell the property. How about taking that bonus, $5,000, and paying the buyer's closing cost? Put it in the MLS and say, seller will pay buyer closing costs up to $5,000. Let the buyer decide what he wants to do with that 5. He can take it off the what? Off the sales price.
Sales price.
My brother, who was selling his house down in the Ozarks a number of years ago, they were going to reduce the price by $5,000. And he had homeowners that he was selling his condo, he was going to buy a single family home down someplace in the Ozarks. And I said, why don't you prepay the homeowners association fees for the buyer at the closing? Take the $5,000 that you were going to offer to the buyer agent and put it in the, and say, we will prepay the homeowners association fees. So let's just say it was for 2 years. Let's just call it that. We're getting close. They did, and it had been on the market for months and it sold 2 weeks later. I still take credit for that. It was 10 years ago. But every Thanksgiving, it was still me that came up with that idea. But here's the deal, guys. The buyer could have said, I'll take it off the price, but at a 6% interest rate, which is use 6 because it works, it's the only number that is a whole number on the for a 30-year mortgage. It's $6 a thousand. So a $5,000 reduction in price saves the buyer, what, $30 a month on a 30-year mortgage. Does he want to save $30 a month forever? Or does he want to save $250 a month for the first 2 years? You make the decision, Mr. Buyer. Does that make sense? Because he can do it any way he wants to. So there is a lot, but you can buy down the interest rate right now on a 2-1 buy down. So there's a lot of things you can do with that other than violate the law. Just thought I'd throw that out there. It just doesn't make any sense to be offering the bonuses. So buy side cooperation, on the buyer side, the co-op compensation is discussed with the seller. Seller makes the final decision. Listing agent puts it in the MLS and prepares the seller for any, probable, outcomes of that. So then and we've talked about the outcomes. There's my bottom line. Buyers don't have extra cash. Lenders won't let them add it to the mortgage. If buyers do pay it themselves, they're going to pay the seller what? Seller less. Seller's property will be more marketable if they're offering compensation, because most of our buyers don't have it. If they do not, it will probably get negotiated into the contract. So bottom line is, I think it's going to end up being the same thing we're doing now. It's just we've got to do it
In a different form.
We've just got to moved our cheese.
And my quote still applies.
And your quote still applies.
Very
So,
relevant.
and just very quickly, and then we're going to get everybody else's opinions. I just want to throw this out there to you, and I want to talk about some of the things we've done to help you with this. What makes you stand out? Why are you unique? What do you, when you're sitting down with a buyer, why should they work with you? Why should you be the one that they choose? It's a good question.
It is.
And a lot of people can't answer it. What we do is important, but most buyers don't know what we do. And I don't think you're going to get commitment out of them to sign a buyer rep agreement with you unless you have given them the commitment of what you're going to do for them. So most clients don't understand who works for who. They don't know how things work at all. Most buyers, when they're interviewed, and NAR does that profile of home buyers and sellers every year. We'll get a new one in November. It's what I look forward to. There's something wrong with me that I just said that out loud. Because we get a new one in November when we go to the meetings. But one of the big complaints the buyers have is, I don't know how I got from we walked in the door of a house and now I'm sitting at the closing table. They have no idea how they got there, which means they have no idea what you do. And we make it look easy. We make it look like buying a house is what? Like falling off a log. And we all know it's not like falling off a log. It's like trying to stand on a log in a river. It's awful, and we don't tell them that. So you need to break this down for your buyers. I've broken it down into like big chunks. We find suitable property, we show property, we analyze the market, we write the offer, we negotiate on their behalf, and we get the thing to the closing table. That's our job in big buckets. You can go out and find lists of on NIR's website, 179 things agents do for their clients. Do you really think that a buyer or a seller is going to sit there and read through a list of 179 things? By the way, not only do they not read the list, but even if they read it, they don't understand what that means to them. They don't understand how all of this works. So just a very quick example. We find suitable property. And I just want to go to the benefit of the buyer, and this is what I wanted to kind of leave you with, or this part of it. Everything you say to them has to be a benefit to them. It isn't going to do you any good to say, I help you find suitable property, sign here. You need to say, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, not all of the properties you see on the internet are available, and not all of the available properties are on the internet. I want you to think about that. It's 100% true, but they don't know that because they think everything that's available is on the internet. And how many times have they called you to show them a property that's on the internet and it's sold and closed, 6 months ago? So you need to explain to them what your job is. So make sure you're doing it. I'm not going to go through all of these. And talk to them about how you add the value. Explain the buying process. Literally from every one of the steps that you go through. You don't have to make it boring. You can make it fun, but you got to explain it to them. And then you have to have the compensation conversation. Most buyer rep agreements say something like this, and this is almost identical to what's in ours. Because I wrote both of them. Yeah, that could be the reason. If during the term of this contract or the protection period, the buyer enters into a contract to acquire real estate, the buyer agrees to pay the brokerage firm something, all right? Whether it's a dollar amount or a percentage. The designated managing broker will make every effort to collect the brokerage fee from the seller or the listing broker. If brokerage firm is not being offered compensation, as a cooperating broker, or compensation being offered doesn't match, then we will inform the buyer of that before we show the property. So I want to make sure you know that. If somebody's offering 4 cents in a chicken, and my buyer rep agreement says I'm getting 12 cents in a chicken, no, 12 cents in a steak, yeah, we'll go with steak, then I have to disclose that I have to disclose that. So it might sound like this. You are in control of how our compensation is paid, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. You will always have the option of asking the seller to pay it. As a matter of fact, you are paying it in the amount you offer to the seller. The seller has factored our compensation into their listing price. If there is ever any time that our agreed upon brokerage fee is not included in the price, I will notify you of that prior to looking at the property, and then we're back to they have their what? Their three options. They can say they don't want to see it, they can pay you, or they can, there it is. I just put it up there again, because I really do like that slide. It's just kind of cute, yeah. So they have choices. So for those of you who do it, well, okay, I'm not going to get real fancy here. Right now, on the 7.0 contract, there is no place for the compensation. We did just create an addendum for Main Street, but not all of the associations have done that. I'll get to the Main Street addendum in a moment. I want to talk to everybody about if you're not Main Street, okay. The only thing you can do, and I totally agree, that we as realtors, licensees, cannot modify the contract, but the buyer can. The buyer can write anything they want to into it. The seller can write anything they want to in it. And the only thing that you can do right now, unless your association or your brokerage company creates something, is to put something like this in there. Buyer requests seller pay additional X% to buyer brokerage at closing and initial it. Because, and again, the attorneys are going to fix that, because that's not the right language. It needs a few more words in there, you think? Probably. But I don't want you or us giving attorney words, does that make sense, to our clients. All they should be putting in there is the what? Basic buyers asking the seller to pay the difference. Now, if no compensation was offered, it wouldn't say additional X%. It would just say buyer requests seller pay X%. That's just common sense. Now, let me do, there is now, for Main Street, a seller agreement to pay buyer brokerage compensation. It was just posted this morning. It was just, they just approved it, well, we just got done writing it, last week, and you guys just approved it yesterday.
We just approved it yesterday.
Yeah. So it is, you're one of the first groups that even knows it's there.
Yeah.
But this you can now attach to the, and this is going to be more acceptable for the attorneys than the little red hen scratching that I had in there. But we had no choice before. We are getting the band back together, by the way. If I say this enough times, it forces everybody to do it. You know that, don't you?
Yeah,
I just keep saying it.
Sweating
I know. We need an 8.0 contract. Because we got a lot of things in the 7.0 that need to be what? Need to be, yeah, I know, that's why I'm saying, if I say it enough times, maybe we'll have to do it.
Let's go back to the 6.0.
Let's go back to the 6.0 or 6.1, I don't know, which one do you want to use? We will be putting something like this in the optional paragraphs.
Yeah.
But guys, please understand, whatever day you're listening to this, it took us 14 months to write the last one. 14 months from the time we started till the time we got the 7.0 done. So don't hold your breath waiting for it, which is why we came up with this. So what this does now is it basically lays out all of that stuff, and then it says, how did we skip that? Or did I not put it in there? Hang on a minute. I didn't. I don't know why. I apologize for that. That's the top of the form. The bottom of the form, which I don't have on the screen, basically just says, the compensation that the seller has offered in the MLS is this. The buyer is asking the seller to pay an additional this. Does that make sense? For a total of the new number. It's very simple.
Yes.
It was very simple.
Yeah.
And so even though I forgot to put the slide on there, it's not going to be that hard for you to figure out. We don't even need a tutorial for it.
Nope.
Aren't you glad? Remember when we did the escalation form and we had the tutorials longer than the form?
It looks like a lot because there's a lot of blanks at the top, but they're simple.
The blanks at the top are just who is everybody.
Yeah.
Who's the listing agent, who's the buyer, I mean, the brokerage and all that other kind of stuff. So it's there, it's on Main Street's website if you need it already, okay? All right, so as I wrap this up, change is the only constant in life. One's ability to adapt to those changes will determine your success in life. Yeah, I don't know who you're gonna get more comments from, Tim or I'm not real sure, but I also want to tell you, and I thought I had a slide in here for this one as well, and I don't. These are the forms, by the way, that you're seeing now that NAR has on their website to help you explain all of this to your clients. So if you go to competition.realtor, you're going to find a lot of these forms. But I also want to talk about, very quickly, the non-exclusive buyer representation agreement. What I'm finding is no matter who I'm speaking to across the country about this, and I talk about it all the time, people, when we say buyer representation agreement, there are people that are automatically assuming it means exclusive representation agreement. It doesn't. We are in the midst of, and we have a meeting on Friday at 4 o'clock to finalize the non-exclusive buyer representation agreement. Hopefully we'll have it up there we'll get to you
Yes.
guys very shortly. You can use a non-exclusive agreement. It's kind of like your exclusive agency listing agreement versus your exclusive right to sell. Does that make sense? With an exclusive agency listing agreement, you're giving the seller permission to what? To sell the house themselves. You can use a non-exclusive buyer rep agreement with your buyer, and now the only time they would owe you commission is if they bought a house that you what? You showed them. They could still work with another agent if they wanted to. They could buy new construction by themselves. They can buy for sale by owner by themselves. So it would get you paid in the cases of 0 in the MLS. Does that make sense? And it will get you paid if you show a new property. So that will be available to you. So when we say you need to use a buyer rep agreement, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a what? Exclusive agreement tying the buyer down. So I've always talked about non-exclusive agreements, and now I'm going to say to you guys the same thing I've said to everybody else. If you need to put training wheels on your bike, then put training wheels on your bike. Because a non-exclusive buyer representation agreement is training wheels. But it might help you get past the feeling many people have that the buyer won't what? Say it. The buyer won't sign it. And that's not true. They do sign it, but it'll get you past that what? That paranoia that they won't sign it.
And I think, in a case where, most realtors, we're getting our leads, they're clients that have come to us by referrals.
Yeah.
So they're coming to us already built in with the know, like, and trust us. And so all we're now doing is having a conversation, which, by the way, we're required by law to have this agency conversation, and now we just are memorializing it in a document. And so if we're using that document, if we're working with somebody that knows, likes, and trusts us already, it's a simple exclusive buyer representation agreement. And if you were talking to somebody that may be a lead that you purchased and you're worried about competition, well, first of all, if you're worried about competition, you definitely should be using the exclusive buyer representation agreement, if you can sell it. And if you're unable to sell it, then the non-exclusive, because you're not going to let that lead go.
Right.
And you still memorialize that conversation. You still have the conversation about, your agency and compensation.
Right.
Now, I do have a question that I'm going to pose to you, because if you're paying attention everywhere else in the world that's talking about our issues that aren't involved in our issues, we do have agents out there that believe that they're not allowed to have the discussion about their compensation with the seller during the contract.
So let me back up a little bit, because that's a good point. I'm not used to this system, so let me see what it... on NAR's website, they have two different things. They both say code comprehension. And this first one is exactly what Tim is talking about. What it says in the Code of Ethics is that we cannot, once we begin negotiating, we cannot unilaterally change the offer of compensation. I said to you that if you have a buyer representation agreement that calls for you to get paid more than what was published in the MLS, you call the listing agent before you show the property. You haven't started negotiating yet, you haven't even shown it. So the code does not forbid us from doing that.
Correct.
And when we do the ABR class and when we do, and there are, by the way, ABR is probably the best thing you can do because we spend 2 whole days and all we do is, and we just rewrote it to have scripts and all kinds of stuff in there for this. But we also have 3-hour CE classes where we talk about the conversation with the buyer, conversation with the seller. And I mentioned in those classes, it might be a good idea for you to have these commission, code comprehension commission form things, they're not forms, they're just flyers,
Yep.
available to send to the listing agent when they start calling you names when you call them. Does that make sense?
Yep.
But it's no different than what I've been telling you guys for years. You should have a picture of standard of practice 1-15 in your phone. When you are in a multiple offer and the listing agent says it's a multiple offer and you say to the listing agent, who has the other offers? And they say, I don't have to tell you that. Oh, yes, you do. But that's not what you want to say to them. You want to send them a copy of 1-15
Yep.
and remind them the code says they have to.
And
This is a good idea to do it that way.
yeah, and I would say that if you're, it is the best idea to have your compensation conversation before you start going showing properties.
Yeah.
Because if you try to have this conversation after you realize that a property is paying 0 and your client wants you now to show them that property, you have a dilemma with Article
Yeah.
16.
Yeah. Because now, and by the way, I'm gonna skirt around it, but I'm gonna tell everybody, we've already had it happen. We've had the ability to put 0 in the private listings since June.
Yep.
And I got a phone call not too long ago from a managing broker who shall go nameless because I had to sign an NDO because he doesn't want anybody to know what brokerage it is. His agent sold a relatively expensive property, over $600,000, with 0 in the compensation. They did not have a buyer representation agreement, and they are now, they're not going to get paid.
And
There's no, how are they going to get paid? The offer of compensation was what? 0. And she didn't,
and like I said, it's non-arbitrable.
no, it's not
There's no
arbitrable.
recourse. And if you're a managing broker, that transaction ends up on your books, you end up liable for it, and you got paid 0.
And that's what I told them, and because she didn't know these buyers really well. Does that make sense? This was more of a call-in kind of thing.
Right, right.
And she said, so you mean I still have to do all the work? And her managing broker and I said, yes, you do. And she said, but I'm not getting paid. I said, no, you're not.
No.
But you still have to do what? You still have to do your job.
Right.
The fact that you're not getting paid doesn't have anything to do, I feel bad for her.
So, I don't know how deep we're gonna get into this, but we were, Kathleen and I were sort of spitballing a scenario like this, where attorneys are gonna get caught up into the middle of this somehow.
Yes.
Especially when you find out that this property is not offering any compensation, and then you try to backdoor the commission agreement, the compensation agreement, and then when it goes to the attorney, because the offer got accepted, the buyer says to their attorney, that wasn't referred to by the agent, of course, says, yeah, the contract's accepted, but, you know, I signed this commission agreement in duress because they weren't gonna present my offer unless I signed. Now the attorney's gotta have another conversation.
Wow. And the agent should be put on an ice floe, sent out to sea and hope Al Gore is right about global warming, but we know that we can't do that with people, so,
You know,
yeah,
because
that's a
the
tough
attorney
one.
represents their
The
client.
client.
Represent the client,
Yeah.
not the agent, yeah.
And so, you know, this makes it all that much more important. Now, all this sounds like a tragedy, right?
Mhm.
But the reality is, we're having the conversation, we're supposed to be having a conversation about agency with the buyer already. And I feel like the reason why our membership is sort of maybe struggling with their, sort of their value proposition
Yeah.
is because they weren't, on a seller, you always were forced to do
Yeah.
that. We were always forced to sit down in front of the seller, win their business. Of course, if they knew, like, and trusted you, it was easy to get them to sign the agreement that memorialized your marketing
Right.
agreement. Well, we weren't forced to do that with buyers. We weren't forced to do that with buyers, and we haven't created a space for us to have that conversation with them because we were in a hurry to shove them in the car and bring them to the door, or we were in a hurry to meet them at the property. And so, and I'd say that, maybe you can still meet them at the property, but maybe you're gonna pause for a moment and have this conversation.
One of the things we put into the new ADR course is a suggestion about the possibility of doing your buyer counseling session on Zoom. So you don't have to meet them in the office or meet them at Starbucks or whatever for a half hour, 45 minutes before. I mean, you can get your own Zoom account, it doesn't cost you anything. You can send them an invitation, as long as you're not trying to do it to 500 people, it won't cost you anything. And you can talk to them. Most people are used to using Zoom.
Yep.
We may not be, but your clients probably are. And you can go through all of that. They're not gonna sign anything necessarily, but at least you've done all of the what? You've done the groundwork, and you've done the value proposition part of it, so.
So the other thing I'm gonna say to the realtors out there is that, although this is all scary and seems like it's new, it's really been around for a very long time. But, I would argue that nothing's really changed. We've been able to negotiate, concessions into contracts.
Yes.
For many, many years we've been doing that. And so this is really just another sort of concession that you're negotiating in the contract. So it's not just one more item negotiated.
But I think, and we talked about this before,
Yeah.
you've got, as a buyer agent, you've got to talk to the lender first.
You've got to talk to the lender.
Yes.
So first and foremost, I've been teaching the agents that worked under me for many, many years, how to use this buyer agreement. And because there's an opportunity in using this buyer agreement,
Yeah.
folks. There's a clear opportunity in using this buyer agreement. Because if you know your value and you're able to communicate that value to somebody, you set your price.
Yep.
And the buyer pays the difference.
That's right.
And the buyer might pay the difference through a concession with the seller, they might pay the difference coming out of their pocket, but that's how it works.
The thing that I want to add to that is that you have to make sure that if you are doing that and you are getting added compensation, that you, as the agent, make sure that the attorney knows,
Yes.
that the lender knows, that the title company knows.
Yeah.
I mean, when I do, like, I had to change my business practices because there's so many lenders now that, in areas that don't use attorneys, that aren't used to seeing attorney fees on the settlement stage. So constantly, as a buyer's attorney, my fee's not on there because, I don't have any relationship with the title company and whatnot. So I've had to change my practices where the moment I start out, the lender, as soon as I figure out who the lender is, they get an invoice from me. So they know that buyer is gonna be paying for that. And then when we get a clear to close, guess what they get again? My invoice. And then when we get to the closing, we get a closing date scheduled, guess what they're getting again? My invoice. So that way they can't say, I didn't realize you had that, and they don't have the money for it. I have found that by doing that on a repetitive basis
Yeah.
and having those conversations up front with the lender and sending my invoice over has helped that where it's less of a problem for me to have to get paid outside of closing by my.
And so-
other
We'll
buyers.
have the same issue.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so as far as communicating your invoice,
Yes.
basically, you have this agreement, you go to contract. I mean, before you go and bring your buyer to contract, you're always having a conversation with your lender.
Yeah.
The buyer's lender anyway, because you need to know if you're gonna build concessions into the transaction, if you're gonna, what do you need? What do you need me to do to put this transaction together? And so, while you're having that conversation, you've already had the discussion with your buyer about the buyer's agreement and your compensation. You tell Mr. and Mrs. Lender, this is what we're doing. I have an agreement with my buyer that I get compensated this much money. I'll send it over to you, and then I'll send it to you again when we get an offer on the property. Here's what happens. If your lender isn't aware that you have that, doesn't know, or finds out too late, then the lender's got to redisclose all over again when you try to send them your invoice. And then the buyer's going to ask the question, well, why do we have to wait another few days? And the lender's going to say, well, because, well, it might come off a couple different ways. The way that I heard it was, well, that's because your agent's gouging you. And then guess
And that
what the
lender
next phone
did come
call?
off of your list.
That absolutely,
Yeah.
that lender was
Yeah.
removed from the.
I
So-
just, I just feel like once you have that offer in place, you've got that agreement that's already been in place,
Put it in your package.
put it in the, yeah, and then make sure that they're getting a commission statement, which I know some agents don't like to do their commission statements too early, because it's kind of a jinx. But you're gonna have to get over that, because it really needs to go out, and then, especially if it's a lender that you haven't worked with before, have that conversation, pick up the phone, call them, you know, because I can tell you right now, Tim, you can send over that exclusive buyers, they're never gonna read it.
I have the conversation with the lender.
They won't read it.
I have the conversation with my
I can
buyers.
guarantee you
If my buyer's got an attorney, I'm having the conversation with the buyer's attorney. And then, what we're not used to doing, well, first, we're not used to using this document.
Right.
But the other thing we're not used to doing is creating an invoice on the buy side.
Right,
And so, I don't, you know, from one of the attorneys that I work with, they were like, I don't care if you scribble it in crayon, get it over to me and I'll make sure it gets on the settlement sheet.
so those are some of the things that, as I said earlier, we're gonna have to make changes all over the place because of this. We just don't even know what they all are yet. We're just gonna go through it and we're gonna go, okay, that's gotta change, this has gotta change. I also wanna say that I've talked to a number of lenders, and some of them have no idea any of this is happening. So I want you to talk to your lenders, I want you to have a conversation with them, because they're the ones who are gonna guide how you're gonna do this. Is it going to be a closing cost credit? Is it gonna be separate? How is it gonna be handled? It depends on the lender, the buyer, depends on a lot of things. But you got some lenders that, I'm serious when I talk to them, and they said,
Yeah, a
I
lot
have
of
no
lenders don't
idea.
even know that this buyer's agreement exists, so
Right.
you've gotta be
Right.
proactive, you've gotta have the conversation. Some attorneys, as we've seen, aren't familiar with the buyer's
Right.
agreement, and so they don't know that they even, that you're looking to put
Yeah.
money on the, so the attorney goes and gives their buyer their final figures, and then you come back and you're like, hey,
Yeah.
Yeah, my fee's not on here,
Yeah.
and that has
Fee's not on.
happened to me before with, and I had no idea that they even had a fee agreement between the buyer and the agent.
Yeah.
So I was never informed of it, and then we're at the closing table, and she's like, you know, my extra $1,600 isn't on here, and I'm like, well, I didn't know you had $1,600 coming to you.
Yeah.
You know, when did you tell me that? You need to create a form that says, you
Yeah.
know, this is my compensation, and I'm getting that from the buyer, I said, and this can't be done at the day of closing.
Yeah.
I said, you have to have these conversations at the beginning of this transaction,
Yeah.
not when we're at the
Well, you
end.
certainly don't want to be the one, after you've expressed the benefits of using you and sold your value proposition, and now you're the one that's holding up the
That
closing.
screws up the closing.
Because
Yeah,
you didn't
that's
send
perfect.
over, because you didn't do the one thing to get paid,
Secure
which
your
was
commission.
send your
an
invoice.
Commission statement.
All right, did we have any
Can
other?
I ask you something?
You certainly can, fire away.
Like, I was sent here by my agent, so obviously, like, they ask this, ask that. Everybody's panicking, let's be
Yeah, they
honest,
are.
right? Especially in Facebook, Instagram, like, everybody going
Yeah,
nuts
stop.
about it.
Stop reading that.
I'm not, I'm not.
I'm gonna write a whole CE class on what not to do in the real estate
Yeah.
business from Facebook.
Please, everybody's panicking. But there are a couple objections that might come from the buyers that are
Okay.
actually, like, it will make sense, right? So when we're gonna start talking about the compensation, that we never did that before, let's be honest. Yes, maybe we were wrong the way we were
Right.
saying about it, but we never negotiated that with the buyer. So basically now my question is, how do you tell them, hey, you know what, maybe you gotta pay me, you know, maybe not.
So-
I understand about the value. My thing is, like, for them, it will be easier to go straight to the listing agents, like,
And
or
have
whatever,
no-
and have no representation, because a lot has
We've got it
happened.
for you, hang on one second.
Okay,
You need to come to the CE classes, you need to take ADR, because the scripts are all in there.
Yeah.
there,
We,
okay.
yes, we've written the scripts,
Okay.
and we've done that for you, but we didn't have time here.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking ADR is 2 whole days.
I'm like,
No, I
I've
signed
got
up for negotiation thing for all those things, but not for the.
I mean,
APR.
after
Yeah,
you've
you need-
expressed your value, discussing your compensation
Should be
clause
easy, should be a
is
no-brainer.
like,
Yeah,
it's so simple.
it's the value proposition that's
So
missing.
simple.
So when a buyer decides to go straight to the listing agent, is the listing agent gonna be a dual agent? Yeah, and I'm gonna say to you that there's a 50-50 chance they're not a dual agent. They're going to be representing only the seller. So
But
I,
with no agency disclosure, they could.
well, you have to do an agency disclosure.
No,
The law
no,
requires
no,
it.
no,
However,
yeah.
But here's the deal. That means that I, as the listing agent, need to say to the buyer, I'll be happy to sell you my listing, but you get no representation from me. Do not disclose anything to me you do not want me to disclose to the seller, because anything you tell me can and will be used against you in the purchase of this property. I'm not even kidding. That's what it needs to sound like.
So honestly, like people are very different now, like listing agents don't do the job as you say right now.
So I don't know that any of us in this room or anybody can be responsible for the unethical agents that are out there, and I
Right,
can't
but
fix
there is
that.
there are a lot of them.
But one of the things that we need to say to the buyer is that you, buying a home, is the largest single monetary investment you'll probably ever make in your life. And choosing the agent that's going to help you buy it, it may even be more important than the house you choose to buy. Because you use the wrong agent, you may never get to the closing table with this house. So choose carefully. Does that make sense? And working directly with the listing agent, who is not going to represent the buyer, puts our business back by 25 years. Back to where we were all working for the what? For the sellers. So let me say this, why aren't they doing it now? Why are the buyers not going to the listing
They
agent?
still do.
Yes, that's my point, I agree with you, they
Still
do.
do not as
Well,
much.
just remind them what it was like when they purchased their car, how they felt.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, how did that feel?
They
Let
didn't
me
feel
go
like they
talk to
got
the
a
guy
deal.
behind the curtain, I'll be back in a minute.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
you want somebody to represent
I mean, it
you,
will
and that's
be
the
challenging.
easiest sort
Yeah.
of comparison.
Yeah,
It will be challenging at some point.
No doubt.
I believe it will be challenging, but
I think at first it'll be challenging, I go, but after you kind
We'll
of
get
get into the
used to it,
routine of it, then it's
You'll be
going to
okay.
be like, this
You'll be
is
okay.
what, this is, I have value and this is what it is. And
It
I need to be
wasn't-
compensated
there was
because of it.
no much information about it. I just started going to the meetings, and when you come to the office and everybody's asking you, hey, what we gonna do? Because everybody's reading Facebook, I didn't even know.
They
that
need to
there
get
are some
trained.
groups in there.
They
And
need to
they're
get
like,
trained.
you
You
know,
can't expect
so
to
I'm
do this
trying
without
to
training,
put it-
guys.
Yeah.
Would you agree with
And
that?
if
Yeah,
you're,
some-
Need training.
you know, this is
Training.
why I'm like, this is so important for our designated realtors to take these courses to learn how to educate their brokers on how to use these documents, how to incorporate it into a purchase contract, and how to teach their agents how to sell that paragraph. You know,
Yeah.
because I mean, we're salespeople. It's a skill. You know, how do you make somebody comfortable signing a paragraph that says that I'm committing, that I'm going to pay you a certain amount of money? And I would say that it's real simple for me. You know, I'll go through the paragraph and I was like, I'll read the paragraph to him. I said, basically what this says is that my minimum fee is this much money. And if there is no offer of compensation from the seller, that you would be responsible for paying the minimum fee. In many cases, there is an offer of compensation from the seller. If that offer of compensation doesn't meet this minimum requirement, then you would be responsible for paying the difference. By the way, I don't want you to fret about it too much, because if it does come to this and we have to talk about it, we're going to talk about it again. And I'm going to tell you how I'm going to negotiate it into the contract for you.
Okay, well, you talk so nice.
Yeah, but
Well,
that's
that's
what we're saying,
exactly
that you have to learn,
what
but you have to learn the script. You asked the question, how do we explain it, and both of us told you.
No, I like it, thank you
Yeah.
so
You
much.
got,
Yeah.
and Dale,
I
yeah,
gave you the script.
Dale's got something to add here too, I'm sure.
Another way to do it is we all have stories of buyers that
Yes.
we helped
Yeah.
and they saw the value in our
That's right.
being present.
Yeah, that's right.
So when you share that story,
Good point.
it's easy to get the buyer to see your value. But can I add something? Something else that's gonna come out of all of this, and this is why I'm not scared. 99% of our listings sell with the help of a cooperating broker. That's the
Correct.
reality. So it is business suicide to not offer compensation. But what else is gonna happen is when we're creating those saved searches for our buyers, we can put in specifics of those saved searches. So you can put in there listings that offer a certain amount of compensation. Now, that may not be appropriate as far as the code of ethics is concerned, but it's a reality. I'm just saying.
They're gonna see it. You're right, the buyers are gonna see it, because it's on the client copy now.
Yeah.
So if all you gotta do, and that's not a problem, you're not searching by that, you're not sorting that
Not
way.
unless your buyer directs you to.
And I would say, and this is the way we teach it in ADR, that if my buyer said, I only want you to show me the listings where it covers my compensation, I would refuse to do that. I would say to him, that is a mistake, because the perfect house for you might be at 0.25% less than what's on our agreement, and now you just missed out on a house. So let me introduce you to all of them, you decide whether or not you want to move forward with them. But to your point, when it's on that client copy now. So when they get it, if they choose to sort that way, they can. So if they've got X in your agreement, and they say, I don't even want to look at these, as long as it's their choice, it's not a problem.
Right.
It's not a problem.
The sellers, though, we're finding in the markets that this already exists, that the sellers, at less than 3% of the listings in
Right.
their MLS are in there
Right,
with
it's
zero. That the sellers have chosen to, the agents are educating now, we've got that opportunity to explain our value proposition to them sitting at the listing, and we're explaining to them. Some sellers are saying, hey, I was looking on Zillow, and I
Yes.
see that the majority of my competition is offering, whatever. I think I want to offer at least that or more.
I've been hearing that everywhere, by the way, guys, that the sellers, when they're thinking about putting their house on the market, they went on to Zillow. And they went on to Zillow to see what other houses are selling for. And it's right there what the compensation is. And they're literally saying that that's what they want to offer. It's a good thought.
In your scripting, do you have suggestions on the situation where maybe a buyer would be going through this and saying, well, they're offering zero compensation and you're approaching me to pay you a compensation and building it into their price? Why wouldn't I just call this agent that has it listed directly and then go into a dual agency situation?
Because you don't control the compensation. The seller is controlling it.
Well, what I'm
I-
saying is that
You also
they
have-
could
But I have a
say,
listing agreement.
I don't have to build it into the price now, because this guy's gonna get paid, I just need him to represent me as well.
So what makes that, so whatever the price is, that's what the buyer's gonna pay for
I'm
it.
saying if it was a motivation to,
But they can do that now.
Well, yeah, I'm saying, do you have
And
anything?
it's happened, it
And no,
happens.
we've got it in there, because
Yeah, I should think there would be
Yeah,
a suggestion that here are the
yeah.
limitations of dual agency.
absolutely right.
Here is a man that's not really your
That's right.
agent, is that how you want to be there? But
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have a
Yes, we do.
script
Yeah,
dealing with
it's an ABR, that's
Okay.
definitely.
One other
ABR.
fast thing, I don't know if you, when we were here on the test run of the early broadcast, you mentioned the date that this moral trial, excuse me, would probably be concluded.
Okay, that's the Sitzer-Burnett trial, the one that
Yes.
started on Monday. They're anticipating it should end somewhere around November 10th. That's
So
their,
maybe
but
think about it.
that's just a guess. Nobody knows how long it's necessarily gonna take.
And then there'll be appeals.
Then there will be appeals,
So
but
it
at least,
could be years.
but we'll at least know how the,
Trend,
Lower level court.
yes, how the court in Kansas City ruled it.
thank you.
Yeah.
The opening arguments were really good on the
NAR.
NAR side.
Yeah, if you've been following it at all, it's been very interesting. They're shooting holes in some of the stuff they're saying, so, and we know there's holes to be shot in some of the things they're saying, so we'll see what happens.
It's our industry, so.
That's
we-
right.
we-
How would this affect rentals?
Probably, my first inclination is it probably doesn't, except there'd be no offer of compensation in the, if it goes to no offer of compensation in the
I would
MLS.
almost argue that if you're
The same
working
way.
in the rental arena, you're used to not being compensated without asking for that.
Yep.
By the way, here's the other thing that comes up all the time. I love it when a commercial broker is in one of these sessions, because they just sit
They
there and
scratch their
say,
head and they're like,
welcome to our world.
Yep.
Yeah, this is-
Welcome to our world. We've been doing this all along.
Residential rentals, it always says how much you.
Yeah, no, it does, but you can, in my market that I'm working, and I work rentals as well. But majority of the time when I'm finding a rental for a client, I can never find anything available on the MLS. I'm using other resources, I'm calling the landlord directly and I'm
Yeah.
telling them what my fee is and asking if they're willing to cooperate. And if they're willing to cooperate, and my client doesn't like it, then I list it.
So the reality is we should be handling the rentals exactly the same way as we handle the sales.
Yeah,
That we should not be dictating to the landlord what they have to pay out in compensation to the to the tenant broker. And we should be handling it the same way. So it really shouldn't be anything any different than what we're doing with the sales, right? Would
it's
you
the
think?
same,
Yeah.
it's the same,
Yeah,
it's the same.
all right.
We've got some good information here.
On the rentals, it sort of works out a little bit easier because you can't, your client in most cases don't even know the rental even exists until you've created the opportunity with the landlord to show them. If you're really been hot and heavy in rentals, you're always having to go to the open market and find somebody because there's just never enough listings in the MLS to provide, access.
There's not enough listings anywhere to provide
No, but
access.
that's a different story, yes. And the rentals, it's always.
The
seems to
rentals,
be the case,
yes.
so
All
it's
right.
always been the
Well,
Wrap it up.
what we'll do, folks, is we will have a replay of this event. We recorded everything today. If you have additional questions, feel free, Citywide Title, we've moderated this thing. We've, trying to get everybody together here to get some information out there just to bring awareness to this. My email, scott@citywidetitle.com, if you have additional questions. We will, probably in the next several days, get the replay out to everyone that registered. If you have questions or something didn't get answered or something pops in your head at 2 a.m., just simply reply back to that email and we'll address it.
I would also say, Scott, if you're watching this video a month from now and you have a question that's not answered,
Yeah,
then still email Scott. We're more than happy to answer those questions because those are the same questions some of our other members maybe have that don't even know that they have, and we want to get those answered. So.
and the only other thing I would add to this is, and you've heard us say this a couple of different ways and whatever, everything keeps changing. And as these lawsuits go through the courts, something else could happen here. We don't know what's going to happen. So you would be advised to be following Inman and Risk Media and NAR, and I know Main Street's sending stuff out.
Watch the
Wall Street Journal, although they're driving everybody crazy lately.
Watch the articles that are coming out of Main Street. Watch the articles that are being emailed to you from Main Street. All of our content regarding all of the stuff that's going on, that's coming out of Main Street, is open for all the public to see it. It's not exclusive to our membership. You can see it anywhere. And so we want to make sure that all the membership, all realtors, have this information and know how to proceed.
Yeah.
And especially if you see an expose in the New York Times.
Yeah, wasn't that awful? Yeah, you've got to be really, really careful what you're reading.
Yeah.
And you also need to be mindful of the fact that, there's a lot of people are casting a lot of aspersions, but don't know all of the details on how all these agreements work.
Right.
And so when somebody says that NAR requires membership in order to be part of the MLS, well, that's not really true. It's really decided by all the MLSs.
That's true, because there are some MLSs that don't require
Correct.
realtor membership to belong to their MLS.
And so there's a lot of that. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of this Article 16. Well, I'm not allowed to, or it's illegal to, talk about my, or negotiate my compensation with the seller. So things like that. Call us. Call our professional standards. We're happy to answer those questions.
Fantastic.
Okay,
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
bye, everybody.
Thank you.